It all began when I was just a teenager, around 17. My mom was away on a business trip, and we've always been close as a family. That's what I thought, at least. My dad, John, was the cool parent. He wasn't overly strict, he didn't pry, and he always knew how to make me laugh. I never felt uncomfortable around him until that summer, when everything changed. My mom left for a 2-week trip to Europe for work, and as usual, my dad and I had the house to ourselves. I was used to it by then. My mom travels a lot for work, so this wasn't anything unusual. What made this time different was the growing tension between us. I hadn't picked up on it before. My dad and I were heading to Europe for work, and as usual, we had the house to ourselves. I was used to it by now. My mom travels a lot for work, so this wasn't anything unusual. But this time, there was a new kind of tension between us. I hadn't picked up on it before. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. My dad had always been affectionate, but this time there was something different about the way he looked at me and the way he talked to me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something had changed. He was being really attentive and complimenting me on things he'd never done before. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, he said, "Rachel, you remind me so much of your mother." I brushed it off, thinking it was just a father-daughter moment. But the way he said it stayed with me as the days went on. I began to notice small things he would brush past me, like his hand, for instance. He'd linger on my shoulder a bit longer than he should, or he'd give me compliments that made me feel a bit uncomfortable. It wasn't outright inappropriate, but there was a feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to brush it off, because it was my dad. There was no way he was trying to imply anything. One evening about a week after my mom left, I got back from a friend's house and found my dad in the kitchen cooking dinner. He gave me a smile, but there was something strange in his eyes. I went over to help set the table, and as I reached to grab a plate, his hand brushed against mine. He brushed against my hand, and it felt like a bolt of electricity shot through me. I quickly stepped back, feeling a lump form in my throat. I couldn't look at him. "Rachel, are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," I replied, avoiding eye contact. We sat down to eat, and the silence between us was awkward. The atmosphere was pretty tense. I wanted to say something to clear the air, but I didn't even know what I was feeling, let alone how to talk about it. After dinner, we sat on the couch to watch TV, which we had always done together, but tonight it felt different. He sat closer to me than usual, with his arm casually draped over the back of the couch, his foot brushing against mine. I felt a tightness in my chest and my heart started racing. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something I wasn't ready to admit to myself. The show we were watching had a scene where the characters were involved in a complicated situation. It was like a real-life relationship, and it seemed to hit a little too close to home. I could feel the tension mounting, not just on the screen but between us. I looked over at my dad and our eyes met for a second. The look he gave me wasn't fatherly, it was something else entirely. It made me feel a bit scared and also quite intrigued. I got up quickly, needing to step away from the intensity of the moment. "I'm going to bed," I said, not waiting for a response. As I left the room, I could feel his eyes on me, and I got a strange feeling in my skin. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he looked at me, it was like something had changed in our relationship. I wasn't sure if I was ready to deal with what that meant. I tossed and turned, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking it and that I was imagining things. But deep down, I had a feeling something had changed. The next few days were a bit of a blur. I tried to avoid spending too much time alone with my dad, making excuses to be out of the house or to go to my room. No matter how hard I tried to avoid it, I couldn't escape the way he looked at me or the way he acted around me. It felt like there was an invisible line between us, and we were both on the brink of crossing it. One night, it all came to a head. I was in the kitchen getting something to eat when my dad came in. It was late, and the house was pretty quiet. I hadn't expected to see him, and I was surprised, so my heart started racing. "I couldn't get to sleep," he asked, leaning against the counter. I replied, feeling at ease. The atmosphere became tense again. He came over to me, standing too close, and looked me in the eye. I could feel my pulse quickening, and my mind was telling me to walk away and put some distance between us, but I was frozen in place. "Rachel," he said quietly, in a low voice. "You know I'm here for you." I nodded, unsure if I could find the words to speak. His hand reached out and brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was so tender and intimate that it made me feel a bit flustered. This was the wrong thing to do. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't move. He was about to say something, but the doorbell rang, cutting him off. We both jumped when the doorbell rang, startled by the interruption. I quickly stepped back, feeling my heart race. "I'll get it," I said, my voice a little shaky as I hurried to the door. I was glad to have something else to think about. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see my mom there with a suitcase. She wasn't scheduled to be back. "I thought I'd surprise you both for another few days," she said with a smile. It was clear she was unaware of the tension that had been building inside the house while she was away. I gave her a smile and stepped aside to let her in. My mind was a whirlwind of relief and confusion. Had she just saved me from something without even knowing it? Or was I just imagining the whole thing? As Mom walked in, she said hi to Dad, who seemed just as frazzled as I was. They chatted briefly, but I could see it in his eyes. The same tension that had been growing between us was still there just beneath the surface. Now that Mom was back, it felt like a time bomb was waiting to go off, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The days after Mom's unexpected return were pretty tense. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to act normal when I was really struggling to keep it together. I could see it in Dad's eyes. He was trying to avoid me, but I could tell there was still a lot of tension between us. He kept his distance and avoided me, but there was still an unspoken tension between us, like a storm cloud waiting to break. Mom was clueless. She was happy to be back home and didn't seem to notice how strange things had become. Maybe she did, but she was too preoccupied. I was busy at work, so I didn't pay much attention to what was going on. I was happy to have her back, though. "Hey," he said, his voice a little tentative. "Can we chat for a bit?" My heart was racing. I wasn't in the mood for a chat. I didn't want to be alone with him, but I also couldn't avoid him forever. I opened the door just a little to see his face. He seemed a bit uneasy. He wasn't sure how to respond to my question. My voice was a little shaky. He let out a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Things have been a bit strange between us lately, and I'd like to change that. I'm your dad, and I love you. I just want you to feel comfortable around me." I looked at him, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was all in my head. I thought maybe I had imagined the way he had been looking at me and touching me. But another part of me knew better. I could tell he felt it too, and we were both trying to ignore it. "I'm okay," I told a little white lie, hoping that would be enough. He was trying to wrap up the conversation, but it wasn't Rachel. He came closer and said, "I want you to know you can talk to me if there's anything on your mind. You can tell me." I swallowed hard and my throat tightened. This was too much for me to handle. I couldn't do this. I took a step back and shook my head. "I'm okay, Dad. Let's just drop it for now. Let's just forget about it." He started to say something, but before he could, the front door slammed open and Mom's voice echoed through the house. "I'm back," she said. She came into the kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the space. I felt a rush of relief. I quickly made my way past my dad and headed downstairs. I heard him let out a sigh behind me, but he didn't follow. Over the next few days, things returned to normal, or at least as normal as they could be under the circumstances. I tried to avoid being alone with Dad as much as possible, and whenever Mom was around, we acted like everything was fine. I was okay, but I still had this uneasy feeling. I knew it wasn't over yet. About a week after Mom got back, she pulled me aside after dinner. "Rachel," she said in a soft but serious tone, "you seem a little off lately. Everything okay?" I felt a sinking feeling in my heart. Of course she had noticed. What could I say in the circumstances? She wasn't. I'd been trying to avoid my father as much as possible, speaking to him only when I absolutely had to. When I did speak to him, I couldn't even look him in the eye. But what was I supposed to say? That my father, her husband, had been acting in ways that made me feel confused and uncomfortable? "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. I'm just feeling a bit stressed about schoolwork at the moment. She looked at me for a moment, her eyes narrowing a bit. It seemed like she wasn't fully convinced, but thankfully she didn't push the issue. She gave me a reassuring smile and nodded. Just know that if there's anything on your mind, you can talk to me. I nodded, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to avoid it. This went on for a while. There was a lot of awkward silence, unspoken words, and me trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But then something happened that made everything come crashing down. It was a Saturday, and my mom had gone out with some friends for the evening, leaving my dad and me alone once again. As soon as she left, I could feel the tension mounting. I tried to stay in my room, but after a couple of hours, I got hungry and headed downstairs to grab a snack. Dad was in the living room watching TV, but as soon as he saw me, he turned it off and stood up. My heart started racing. I could feel that same old unease creeping in, that same tightness in my throat. "Hey," he said, in a casual tone of voice, but with something behind it that made my skin crawl. "Hi," I said, avoiding eye contact as I grabbed a bag of chips from the pantry. I was heading back upstairs when he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Rachel, could we have a quick chat? I don't like how things have been between us." I wasn't keen on talking or being alone with him, but I had no choice. I turned around reluctantly too. I looked him in the eye, feeling a bit nervous. He came over to me, standing too close, his eyes searching mine. I could feel my heart beating faster and my breathing getting quicker. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, placing a hand on my arm. "Perhaps we should talk through this. There's been a bit of a tension between us. I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding between us, and I think it's time we talked about it." I took a moment to collect myself before speaking. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." He lingered on my arm for a moment, and I thought he was going to say something else. That would finally be the last straw. But then, as if by some miracle, the doorbell rang. I jumped at the sound and quickly pulled away from him. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might leap out of my chest. "I'll get it," I said, heading quickly to the door. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see my mom standing there again. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with worry. "Mom, what's going on?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked past me into the house. Her eyes swept the room as if searching for something or someone. Then she looked, and when she spoke, her voice was a little shaky. "I need to speak with your father." I could tell she'd figured it out. Or at least she'd picked up on something being amiss. My heart dropped, and I stepped aside to let her into the house as she walked past me. I looked over at my dad, who was standing there, frozen in the middle of the living room. His face was pale. In that moment, everything shifted. The pressure had finally reached its limit. My mom knew something, and I wasn't sure if it was enough to cause a major rift in our family. It felt like we were on the brink of something big, like we were standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall.